This video is going to be about margin, border, and padding, which seems simple but can cause all kinds of unexpected problems when you attempt to do a more complex layout with your CSS. So it's a foundational thing that you understand these right away. So I've got a simple page here, and the HTML, very simple, no classes, no IDs. There's an H1, there are two paragraphs, there is a third short paragraph, an image, and a final paragraph. That's all there is. No divs, no articles, no sections. And the CSS right now is very, very simple. It affects only the font, the color and background of the entire page, nothing else. So the first thing I want to do with this, well, let's set it up so that both things are on screen at the same time. The first thing I want to do is show you how many elements have a margin added to them by the browser. And this margin is not going to be consistent on every browser. So it's important to recognize that often we need to zero out the margins or apply a specific margin to, in particular, the headings and the P elements, because the browser's got margins on them. So the first thing I'll do is show you how the paragraphs will look if I give them a margin of 0. And that is a margin on all four sides. If you just put one number, it's top, right, bottom, left, all four sides. So I reload, and all of a sudden, my paragraphs are all squashed up together, right? What about the heading? If I add a selector for the H1 and give it a margin of 0, save, and reload. Yep, the heading also had some default margins on it. Now the image doesn't, but what about this very, very small amount of space on the left side and the right side? And maybe even there's a small amount of space at the top and the bottom. Yes, the body itself usually has some kind of margin on it, given by the browser. So let's reload, and yep, the top and sides and bottom of the page had margins applied. Now, you don't want the page to look like this, but what you need to know is that if you want the margins to be consistent, you should probably give each of these elements a specific margin that's the margin you want. So in this case, let me, I'm going to use pixels because you may not have watched the video about measurements yet. But pixels are one way to do this. And what if I give this, say, 20 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 extra pixels on the left and right? And the heading, possibly the same as the paragraph. So I have given the body a margin on all four sides because I only gave one number. I have given the paragraph and the H1 a margin of 20 pixels on the top and bottom, the first number, and on the left and right, I've given both of them 0. Because I know I've got 20 pixels with the body on the left and right, so maybe I don't need any more. How's this going to look? I save and I reload, and that looks a little more like it looked when we started, right? Now maybe you want even more, and that's okay. But what is the best way to give more space around the entire content of this document? The best way would be to do it in the body, because you don't want to have to keep adding different margins in every element, like the P, like the H1, and then if you have other H elements, and you have articles and sections and asides and nav, you don't want to have to give margin to everything and then change them if you don't like them. So your first stop for margins is do it in the body and it will affect the whole page equally. So we have doubled the margin on all 4 sides. To make this really, really, really noticeable, let me give it 80 pixels, right? So now there's a big margin on the bottom, there's a big margin on the left and right, there's a big margin on the top. This margin will stay the same if we make the page full size again. Before we leave the topic of margins, I want to show you what margin collapse means. So we've got a margin on all 4 sides for the body of 80 pixels. So that means there is a top margin on this page of 80 pixels. Then the first thing we see on the page is the H1. It has a top and bottom margin of 20 pixels. What if I increase that margin from 20 to 40? You would expect to see more space above this heading, right? You'd expect to see more space above as soon as I save my CSS and reload this page. You saw some more below. You did not see any increase above. Let me change it to 60. Changing the H1 top and bottom margin to 60. Save. Reload. Again, the top did not change at all. The bottom did, the top did not. This illustrates margin collapse, which is a normal thing in all web browsers. The margin that is biggest, which happens to be the body, so the top margin on the body is 80 pixels. That will be the only margin at the top of the page, no matter how big we make the H1. Unless we make its top margin larger than 80, you won't see any change. So the space above this heading remains 80 pixels because the top margin of the body is 80. And if we wanted to change this top margin on the heading at all, we would have to go above 80. Then if we changed the body margin to 100 and reload, again, we don't see any change on the top margin because these 2 margins, what margin collapse really is that margin, that top margin on body and the top margin on H1, they overlap, they cancel each other out. So you will never get 200 by doing 100 in the same place. You will only have a maximum of 100 pixels. And that concludes your introduction to margin. Next, padding and border.